The long line of trucks rattled through the dusty road, carrying dozens of weary women who only months before had been part of the collapsing Reich. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, uniforms and civilian coats hanging loose over bodies worn thin by hunger and exhaustion. They had heard the rumors whispered among captured soldiers. America had no mercy. Some believed they would be beaten, others that they would be left to starve, forgotten in distant pens across the ocean. The war had already stripped them of everything, and now they waited for the final cruelty. When the convoy halted at a camp somewhere in the American South, the women stepped down under the gaze of armed guards. Barbed wire stretched in long arcs, watchtowers rose against the sky, and the sound of boots crunching gravel echoed ominously. Every instinct told them to prepare for humiliation, but as they shuffled toward the processing tent, something unexpected drifted through the air, an aroma, sweet and warm, that made them pause. It was not the stench of damp straw or the metallic tang of a prison mess. It was the smell of fried dough and sugar. Inside the tent, American women in uniforms, Red Cross volunteers, stood behind tables lined with trays. The prisoners froze in disbelief as each was handed a small round donut still warm and a paper cup filled with a fizzy caramel-colored drink. The hiss of carbonation rose above the murmurs of confusion. "Coca-Cola," one of the volunteers said brightly, as though the word alone was enough to explain everything. The Germans stared at the strange beverage, bubbles rising against the thin paper walls of the cup. They glanced at each other nervously, some whispering that it might be poisoned. But hunger and curiosity were stronger than fear. One young woman raised the cup to her lips. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, sharper and richer than anything she had tasted in years. Another broke off a piece of the donut, the soft dough and sugar sticking to her fingers. Tears welled in her eyes as she swallowed, because the taste was so far removed from the bitter scraps of war that it felt almost like cruelty. But the Americans were not mocking them. They offered the donuts and soda, with the same casual ease as though serving their own soldiers. That perhaps was what unsettled the German women most of all, not the sweetness, not the generosity, but the sheer normality of it. They had been raised to believe their enemy was barbaric, ruthless, and filled with hatred. Instead, here they were, offered a smile, a pastry, and a bottle of America's most famous drink. Some of the women laughed nervously, unsure if it was permitted to enjoy this unexpected gift. Others ate in silence, their hands trembling as they held the food. A few openly wept, overwhelmed by the sudden realization that their captors treated them with more kindness than their own army ever had. For the first time in years, they tasted sugar without ration cards, sweetness without guilt. The scene was small in scale, just a table, a snack, a drink, but it carried the weight of an empire's collapse. In that moment, these German women saw with their own eyes that America was not only strong in weapons, but abundant in spirit. The donut and Coca-Cola became symbols, a message wrapped in sugar and fizz. The war was over and the world they had known was gone. And so the central question arose: why would America, locked in a brutal war, offer kindness to its prisoners? What did it mean that a nation so powerful chose to greet defeated enemies not with fists, but with pastries and soda? The answer would unfold in ways none of these women could have imagined. By 1944 and 1945, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. Cities lay in ruins from Allied bombings. Food shortages left families hungry, and millions of soldiers were scattered across collapsing fronts. As the Reich crumbled, thousands of women, auxiliary workers, nurses, clerks, and even civilians swept up in the chaos, found themselves captured alongside their male counterparts. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever stepped outside of the iron grip of Nazi propaganda. From the earliest days of the war, Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi press had portrayed the Allies, especially the Americans, as brutes and degenerates. Posters and broadcasts warned that surrender to the Western powers would bring humiliation, starvation, and abuse. To women in particular, the threat seemed clear. They would be treated with cruelty, perhaps worse, by enemies painted as soulless and decadent. Surrender meant dishonor, they were told, and captivity meant misery. Yet rumors began to filter back from the front. Soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy wrote cautious letters that, when not censored, hinted at decent food, clean barracks, even medical care. Some mentioned packages from the Red Cross and humane treatment that contrasted sharply with how Germany handled its own prisoners. Still, these reports were hard to believe. The propaganda machine insisted they were fabrications, American tricks designed to sap the will to fight. By the time German women began arriving in POW camps, many were braced for the worst. They expected to find themselves in barren enclosures, given scraps of food, and treated as nameless captives. What they discovered instead was startling. American camps, though still prisons, were governed by the Geneva Conventions. Prisoners received structured meals, basic health care, and even small comforts. Guards were under orders not to abuse captives. And above all, American abundance was impossible to hide. The simple availability of sugar, coffee, chocolate, or soda, items almost mythical in wartime Germany, was enough to disorient the prisoners. Where German civilians at home boiled acorns to make bitter coffee substitutes, in America, steaming cups of real coffee were poured with casual ease. Where German rations shrank to paper-thin slices of bread, U.S. guards casually ate sandwiches and handed out pastries. And where German propaganda had declared Americans soft and lazy, the prisoners saw a nation so rich in resources that even its enemies were treated to luxuries. Among these luxuries, two stood out in memory: donuts and Coca-Cola. They were not only food items but cultural symbols, deeply tied to American identity. Donuts, served at Red Cross stations and camp canteens, carried connotations of comfort, homeliness, and warmth. Coca-Cola, with its fizz and sweetness, represented modernity, prosperity, and the everyday normalcy of American life. For German women POWs, who had spent years deprived of sugar and comfort, these items carried an almost surreal weight. The psychological impact was immediate. Where fear had prepared them for brutality, the taste of a donut or sip of Coca-Cola suggested something far more powerful: that their enemy was not only militarily stronger, but also socially and economically untouchable. America's ability to wage war while still enjoying luxuries highlighted a wealth and confidence that Nazi Germany could never match. This clash between expectation and reality raised questions that lingered in their minds. If the Americans were truly as cruel and decadent as they had been told, why did they offer kindness? If America was supposedly collapsing under its own weakness, how could it afford to feed prisoners better than German civilians at home? These contradictions gnawed at the prisoners and began to dismantle the myths they had lived under for years. As the women settled into camp life, their shock did not fade quickly. Every cup of coffee, every cigarette, every sweet pastry reminded them that the Reich's narrative had crumbled. The smallest gestures carried enormous weight, reshaping their understanding of the enemy. For many, it was not the roar of American tanks or bombers that left the deepest impression, but the quiet generosity of everyday comforts. And so the stage was set for a profound cultural clash. These German women had stepped into captivity expecting violence and starvation. What they found was something entirely different: a nation that revealed its strength not only through weapons, but through donuts and Coca-Cola. The journey into captivity was often the most terrifying part. For many German women prisoners, auxiliary nurses, communication staff, or civilians caught up near the front, the first hours after capture were filled with dread. They remembered how Nazi propaganda had warned them that Americans were monsters, capable of cruelty beyond imagination. Films and speeches had told them that women especially would suffer terribly if they fell into Allied hands. The thought of captivity conjured images of beatings, starvation, or worse. When trucks or trains carried them toward the camps, many clutched each other's hands in silent fear. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly ahead, numb with exhaustion. What none of them expected was to arrive at orderly compounds with rows of wooden barracks, kitchens, and medical stations. The shock of that first impression, of a system that seemed built not on vengeance but on routine, was enough to unsettle years of indoctrination. In their earliest days, the women noticed details that seemed impossible compared to life back home. Guards wore clean uniforms, their boots polished, their expressions calm rather than hostile. American officers gave clear instructions through interpreters, and while the tone was strict, it lacked the sneering cruelty many had anticipated. When meals were served, the prisoners braced for bowls of watery soup or dry bread. Instead, trays often carried potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes even meat. Coffee, though thin by American standards, was still coffee, real, rich, and sweetened. For women who had spent months boiling ersatz brews of barley or acorns, the taste was almost intoxicating. One German nurse captured in Normandy in the summer of 1944 later recalled her disbelief. "They gave us bread so soft that it seemed unreal. At home we had chewed on crusts that crumbled like sand. Here it was as though I was eating clouds." Another remembered the moment she was handed a cigarette. "I thought it was a mistake. Why would a guard give me something that even my brother at the front rarely received?" The surprise deepened with small, almost casual gestures. Guards sometimes shared newspapers or allowed music from camp radios to drift through the compounds. American Red Cross volunteers appeared with trays of food, and it was then that many of the women encountered the quintessential symbols of America: donuts and Coca-Cola. At first, some prisoners refused to touch them, fearing a trick. But as others tasted and laughed with relief, suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to wonder. The donut was more than fried dough. It was a direct contrast to the scarcity of German life. In bombed-out cities, sugar was rationed so tightly that mothers would trade on the black market for a few spoonfuls to make a child's birthday cake. Here sugar seemed abundant enough to dust over pastries for prisoners. Coca-Cola, meanwhile, was unlike anything many had tasted before. The fizz shocked their tongues, the sweetness lingered, and the dark caramel color made it seem exotic. A few women recalled drinking it slowly, savoring every sip as though afraid it might vanish. This first exposure to American abundance was not lost on them. Some felt ashamed, realizing that their families at home were hungry, while they, as prisoners, sipped soda. Others felt an almost guilty relief, knowing that captivity might mean survival after all. For many, it was the first crack in the wall of Nazi propaganda. They had been told Americans were decadent weaklings. Yet here they were, offering food luxuries their own officers had never provided. The contrast to German treatment of prisoners could not have been sharper. News had spread quietly among German ranks about how their own army had starved Soviet POWs by the millions, leaving them to die in open-air camps. Women knew that in Germany itself, discipline was harsh and compassion rare. Soldiers who faltered were punished, not comforted. Against that background, the sight of an American guard casually handing out cigarettes or donuts was more than surprising. It was disarming. For the women, the first days of captivity were filled with conflicted emotions. Relief mingled with shame. Gratitude sat uneasily beside suspicion. Yet above all, there was astonishment. They began to realize that captivity might not be the nightmare they feared. Instead, it might even be a strange kind of reprieve. As days turned into weeks, the pattern repeated. Meals were regular. Medical staff checked on the sick. Some women were assigned work details that kept them occupied, but not brutalized. Sewing uniforms assisting in kitchens or maintaining gardens. In the evenings, when camp lights glowed and music drifted faintly from radios, the prisoners could not help but compare it to the rubble of German cities. While their families struggled for survival under bombings, they were being treated with a level of care that felt almost surreal. One prisoner later wrote in her diary, "I had believed America to be savage, yet here I was, sipping a drink with bubbles that tickled my throat, eating food sweeter than I had seen in years. The world I had known was gone, and I did not know what to believe anymore." The initial shock of donuts and Coca-Cola was just the beginning. It was a signal of something much larger, the revelation that America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its abundance. And for the German women who had once laughed at the idea of American weakness, the lesson was only beginning. As the weeks stretched into months, the shock of survival slowly gave way to a deeper understanding of what captivity in America truly meant. The German women who had expected hunger and cruelty instead discovered that the rhythm of life inside the wire was oddly structured and in some ways even humane. The American guards followed rules that were rooted in the Geneva Conventions, and those rules extended beyond mere subsistence. They reflected a philosophy: prisoners should be managed but not humiliated. Food became the central symbol of this philosophy. In wartime Germany, meals had been stripped down to the bare minimum. Thin slices of bread, watery cabbage soups, potatoes rationed to the ounce. Sugar, butter, and coffee were luxuries almost entirely absent from daily life. But in the camps, food was not just plentiful compared to Germany, it carried cultural weight. The women were introduced not only to staples like bread, meat, and vegetables, but also to the small luxuries that Americans considered normal: donuts, Coca-Cola, candy bars and coffee strong enough to warm the soul. The donuts often came from volunteers working with the Red Cross or the Salvation Army. For many of the women, the sight of these volunteers, sometimes middle-aged American women in uniform aprons, was disarming. The volunteers smiled, handed out pastries and chatted with guards, behaving as though serving prisoners was no different from serving their own sons. For German women raised in a culture where the enemy was portrayed as savage, the sight of women offering them kindness felt surreal. One recalled later, "I could not imagine our own mothers serving coffee to English prisoners. It would have been unthinkable. Yet here it seemed natural." Coca-Cola carried an even stronger symbolic weight. By the 1940s, it was already a global brand, tied to images of modernity, leisure, and American identity. To taste it for the first time in captivity was to taste the wealth of a nation that could fight a world war and still devote resources to fizzy sweetness. Some women sipped slowly, marveling at the bubbles, while others gulped eagerly, laughing as the carbonation stung their throats. A prisoner from Bavaria later admitted that it was Coca-Cola, more than tanks or airplanes, that convinced her Germany had already lost. "We had nothing like it, and they gave it away freely, even to us. It was then I realized the war was hopeless." Daily life reinforced these impressions. Work details assigned to the women were often practical rather than punishing. Some worked in laundries or kitchens, others assisted in sewing shops or maintaining camp gardens. A few were even allowed to help with clerical work under supervision. The tasks kept them busy but rarely brutalized them. In exchange, they were often rewarded with cigarettes, coffee, or small treats. The system was transactional, but it was also deeply revealing. In America, even prisoners could access comforts that German civilians back home desperately craved. Entertainment was another surprise. Radios occasionally played swing or jazz, music long banned in Germany as degenerate. Some of the women recoiled at first, but curiosity soon overcame ideology. They found themselves tapping their feet to rhythms that carried a freedom absent from the martial marches of home. On Sundays, chaplains sometimes visited, offering services and conversation. There were books in camp libraries, some in German, that prisoners could borrow. These touches of normalcy added to the growing realization that America's power was not only military, but cultural. And then there were the interactions with civilians. On farm details in the American Midwest, some German women worked alongside local families, harvesting crops or tending fields. At first, they expected hostility. Instead, many encountered polite, if reserved, kindness. Farmers shared meals with them during work breaks, offering sandwiches, coffee, and sometimes donuts from the local bakery. Children stared curiously at the enemy women, but occasionally slipped them apples or candy. The contrast with how the Reich had treated foreign laborers, Poles, Russians, and others, who were beaten and starved, was stark. For many of the women, the realization grew heavier with each passing week. America had been painted as a land of greed and weakness, yet here in captivity, they experienced a wealth of food, clothing, and comfort, unmatched by anything they had known under the swastika. They began to question the propaganda they had once believed. If this was how America treated prisoners, what did that say about its strength? Not all reacted with gratitude. Some remained suspicious, convinced it was a trap meant to soften their resolve. A few clung stubbornly to Nazi ideology, dismissing the donuts and Coca-Cola as meaningless bribes. But for the majority, the shock of abundance chipped away at their old certainties. One former camp prisoner later wrote, "The Reich had told us we were the chosen people. Yet in America, we saw that they treated even their enemies better than our leaders treated us." Psychologists who later studied the POW experience noted how small comforts could carry enormous psychological weight. A cigarette handed out by a guard was not just tobacco, it was a symbol of status, proof that the prisoner was still considered human. A donut or bottle of Coke was not just food. It was proof that America had so much that it could afford to be generous, even to those who had tried to kill its sons. This generosity carried strategic value. Well-fed prisoners were easier to manage. Content prisoners were less likely to rebel or resist, but it also carried moral weight. By treating their captives with dignity, Americans demonstrated that their system of values, democracy, abundance, fairness, was not propaganda, but reality. The German women who lived through these months began to grasp that their defeat was not only on the battlefield. It was in the kitchens, in the canteens, in the small luxuries that appeared casually on trays. The war had pitted ideology against abundance, and the result was clear. In the end, it was not just the roar of American bombers or the advance of Sherman tanks that humbled them. It was the taste of donuts and the fizz of Coca-Cola, symbols of a nation whose strength lay as much in its culture and economy as in its armies. As weeks turned into months, the cultural and psychological consequences of captivity became clearer. For German women held in American camps, the shock of donuts and Coca-Cola was only the beginning of a deeper transformation. What started as astonishment soon turned into reflection, and reflection into comparison. Slowly they began to realize that their experience behind barbed wire was in some ways more humane, even more dignified than the lives they had left behind under the Reich. Letters from home often painted a grim picture. Families described bombings, food shortages, the endless struggle for survival in shattered cities. Bread was rationed to tiny portions, sugar almost non-existent, and coffee a memory. Mothers fretted about feeding children with watery soups of turnips or beets, while fathers queued for hours to receive scraps of coal. In contrast, the women in American captivity received structured meals with protein, vegetables, and, most astonishingly, sweets. It was not lost on them that the enemy provided them more security and nutrition than their own leaders had given their families. The collapse of Nazi propaganda was another consequence. Years of indoctrination had painted Americans as lazy, materialistic, and morally corrupt. But in the camps, German women saw guards who were disciplined, volunteers who were kind, and a system that operated with rules rather than whims. They saw abundance that could not be faked: Coca-Cola by the crate, donuts fried fresh by volunteers, cigarettes handed out like they were endless. Even when discipline was enforced, it was done within boundaries. The brutal caricatures of Allied cruelty no longer matched reality. One former prisoner recalled, "I expected blows. Instead, I was given food. I expected humiliation. Instead, I was treated with indifference, sometimes even kindness. It was confusing, but it forced me to think." That forced reflection rippled through the camps. Women who had once parroted slogans about German superiority began to quietly admit, at least among themselves, that America's wealth and confidence were undeniable. Another consequence was psychological disarmament. Cruelty often hardens resolve. Kindness, in contrast, can unsettle it. American guards may not have intended it as strategy, but their simple adherence to humane treatment undermined years of Nazi indoctrination more effectively than violence could have. Prisoners began to laugh during breaks, to savor coffee and donuts, to allow themselves moments of humanity they had suppressed under constant pressure to serve the Reich. In these moments, the war felt far away, and the enemy no longer seemed monstrous. Some women began to record their experiences in diaries, often hidden from guards but sometimes encouraged by camp officials. They wrote of the strangeness of being offered treats, of their first taste of Coca-Cola, of the way American music drifted over the fences at night. They compared their captivity to their brothers' letters from the Eastern Front, where the Soviets treated German POWs with merciless brutality. The contrast was stark. Westward meant survival, eastward meant likely death. Cultural exchange also played a role. Through work details and occasional interactions with American civilians, the women encountered a society far different from the one they had imagined. On farms in the Midwest, they met families who invited them to sit under shade trees and share sandwiches during breaks. Children gawked at the enemy women, but often smiled or handed them small gifts of fruit or candy. For women raised in an ideology that exalted German superiority, it was humbling to realize that even ordinary American farmers lived lives of relative abundance compared to what they had known. The broader impact extended beyond the fences. When the war ended and repatriations began, many of these women carried their memories back to a broken Germany. They told friends and family about the donuts, the Coca-Cola, the cigarettes, the clean barracks, the structured routines. Their testimonies chipped away at lingering myths about the war and helped shape post-war German perceptions of America. For some, the experience planted seeds of curiosity or even admiration. Later, when American culture flooded into West Germany, jazz, Hollywood films, Coca-Cola advertisements, it felt familiar, not foreign. The POW camps had been an introduction. There was also guilt. Many women admitted they felt uneasy enjoying comforts while their families starved under bombs. One wrote bitterly, "In captivity, I ate better than my mother in Cologne. It was shameful, and I could not speak of it when I returned." The guilt mingled with gratitude, creating a complicated memory that lasted decades. But even guilt underscored the same truth, that the enemy had treated them better in defeat than their own regime had in loyalty. For historians, the testimonies of these women are crucial. They reveal not just the collapse of an army, but the collapse of a world view. America's strength was not only its tanks and planes, but its ability to wage war while still enjoying luxuries. The donuts and Coca-Cola were not trivial. They were weapons of soft power, undermining the psychological defenses of prisoners and proving the wealth of a system built on democracy and industry. By 1945, the cumulative effect was clear. German women prisoners no longer feared their captors. Some even respected them. The simple acts of sharing food and drink had done what bombs and bullets could not. They had humanized the enemy, revealed the propaganda for what it was, and left a lasting imprint. And so the consequences stretched far beyond the fences of the camps. When post-war Europe slowly rebuilt, many of these women remembered not just the ruin of their cities, but the taste of American abundance. Donuts and Coca-Cola became symbols of a world that had defeated them and in strange ways welcomed them. It happened on a bright spring morning in 1945, only weeks after the collapse of the Reich had become inevitable. A group of German women prisoners was marched into the camp canteen, their footsteps heavy, their faces set in expressions of weary defiance. They expected the same routine as before: bread, watery soup, perhaps a slice of potato. But what greeted them that morning would become a memory, etched into their lives forever. On long wooden tables, volunteers had arranged rows of trays. Each tray carried a small glazed donut and a bottle of Coca-Cola chilled on ice. The donuts glistened under the lights, sugar crystals catching the morning sun. The bottles of Coke hissed and popped as caps were pried off, the fizzing sound filling the air like a strange kind of music. The German women froze in place, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. At first, suspicion gripped them. Was this a test? A cruel trick? For women who had endured bombings, hunger, and the collapse of everything they had known, the idea of being offered luxuries seemed impossible. Some crossed their arms, refusing to move. Others exchanged wary glances, whispering that perhaps the food was meant to humiliate them. But the American volunteers waited patiently, smiling, urging them forward. Finally, one prisoner stepped ahead. She was young, no older than 20, her hair still tucked beneath the kerchief she had worn during her work detail. With trembling hands, she lifted a bottle of Coca-Cola. She hesitated, then took a sip. Her eyes widened as the bubbles danced on her tongue, the sweetness overwhelming. She gasped softly, then laughed, a sound so unexpected in the canteen that others turned to look. The tension broke. Another woman reached for a donut. She tore off a piece and placed it in her mouth. The softness, the sugar, the warmth of fried dough, it was too much. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she chewed. She whispered almost to herself, "This cannot be real." One by one, the women surrendered to the moment. Bottles were lifted, donuts eaten, the clinking of glass mixed with the sound of laughter, and even sobs. Guards and volunteers looked on quietly, understanding that something profound was unfolding. These were not just prisoners eating food. They were women confronting the collapse of everything they had been told about their enemy. The symbolism was unavoidable. Donuts and Coca-Cola were not merely snacks. They were emblems of a nation that could fight a global war and still treat prisoners with abundance. For German women raised on rations, who had seen children starve and families scrape by on acorn coffee and black bread, the contrast was overwhelming. America's wealth was not only military, it was cultural, industrial, and personal. It was a wealth that could be tasted in a bite of sugar and a sip of soda. One of the women whispered to another, "If this is defeat, then it is kinder than victory at home." The words spread down the table, repeated in low voices, until it seemed every prisoner had heard them. Defeat had been painted as horror, but here it carried sweetness and humanity. The moment did not erase the bitterness of war. It did not erase the bombings, the loss of loved ones, the knowledge of a homeland in ruins. But it planted something new, an undeniable awareness that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not only stronger, but also capable of compassion. When the women returned to their barracks that day, they carried more than full stomachs. They carried the realization that America's true strength lay not only in its armies, but in its ability to share luxuries so casually, even with those who had fought against it. For the rest of their lives, the taste of that donut and the fizz of that Coca-Cola would remain symbols of a war lost and a worldview shattered. When the war ended and the barbed wire fences began to come down, the memories the German women carried with them were complex. They remembered the humiliation of defeat, the ache of longing for families left behind in a shattered homeland, and the uncertainty of what waited for them in ruined cities. Yet alongside those memories lived something unexpected, the taste of donuts and Coca-Cola, offered not as bribes, but as everyday gestures from their captors. For many of these women, the experience was a revelation. Nazi propaganda had insisted that America was decadent, cruel, and weak. But in the camps, reality overturned every claim. The Americans had been disciplined yet humane, firm yet generous. The food, the music, the cigarettes, the smiles, they all pointed to a strength rooted not in brutality, but in confidence. America could afford to treat prisoners well, because it had nothing to fear. The psychological effect was profound. Years later, when former prisoners gave interviews or wrote memoirs, they rarely spoke first of hardship. Instead, they recalled the shock of abundance, the kindness of volunteers, and the surreal experience of tasting luxuries denied to them in Germany itself. "I ate better as a prisoner than my mother in Cologne," one woman admitted, her words tinged with both gratitude and guilt. Another remembered the first sip of Coca-Cola as the moment she realized that the Reich's promises had been lies. The legacy stretched beyond individual memories. After the war, as American culture flooded into West Germany, jazz records, Hollywood films, and of course Coca-Cola advertisements, the ground had already been prepared. For women who had once tasted these things behind barbed wire, they were not foreign intrusions. They were reminders of survival, of a moment when defeat carried with it an unexpected glimpse of a different kind of world. This was America's soft power in its purest form. No speech could have dismantled Nazi myths as effectively as a donut dusted in sugar. No propaganda leaflet could have shaken belief as completely as a bottle of Coke shared casually with prisoners. The war was fought with tanks and planes, but it was remembered in these small human moments that revealed the true scale of American strength. Yet the memories also carried a shadow. Many women felt guilty knowing that in captivity they had tasted sweetness while their families starved. Some could never speak of it openly, fearing resentment or misunderstanding. For them, the donut and Coca-Cola were bittersweet symbols, reminders of both their own survival and their nation's collapse. Still, the larger truth remained. America had defeated Germany not only with weapons but with values. By treating prisoners with dignity, it had proven the hollowness of Nazi ideology. By offering abundance, it had demonstrated the reach of its industry and culture. And by surprising its captives with kindness, it had reshaped lives in ways that endured long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the story of German women prisoners is not just about food. It is about the moment when fear gave way to astonishment, when propaganda crumbled under the weight of reality, and when two simple items, donuts and Coca-Cola, became symbols of a new world order. Wars are remembered for their battles, but they are often understood through their smallest details. For these women, the sound of a bottle cap popping, the taste of sugar on the tongue, and the warmth of coffee offered without malice told them more about America than any battlefield could. And it leaves us with a lingering question. If kindness and abundance could shake belief in tyranny during war, what power might such gestures hold in times of peace?